Imagine for a second, right, that you are sitting down to design the ultimate video game character.
Oh, like when you first boot up an RPG and you have all those sliders for their stats.
Exactly. You are right there in the character creation menu. You have these sliders, right? And on one side, you want absolute loyalty. You want a companion who will follow your commands, who understands the assignment, who genuinely wants to work with you.
Right, the high trainability stat.
Yeah. But then on the other side of the menu, you want raw, untamed superpowers.
Yeah.
I mean, you want insane stamina, the ability to see in the dark, senses sharp enough to navigate a forest at midnight, and like a physical engine that basically never quits.
It's funny because that premise sounds like pure science fiction, but it is actually a very foundational concept in evolutionary biology.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is, because, I mean, you are basically describing the attempt to take the highly selective domesticated traits we've engineered into animals over thousands of years, and then, fuse them with the apex survival-tested abilities forged by millions of years of natural selection.
And usually that kind of thing stays in video games or superhero movies or those late-night hypothetical conversations you have with your friends. But today we are talking about a time when scientists actually did this in real life.
And it was an incredibly complex undertaking.
Oh, absolutely. And I am talking directly to you, the listener, right now, especially if you are sitting in biology class, maybe zoning out a bit, wondering what all those genetics lessons, those Punnett squares, and those dominant and recessive traits actually do in the real world.
Because they do have massive real-world applications.
Right. So today we are skipping the dusty history books. We are not going to talk about the boring politics or the military bureaucracy or like the border guard paperwork that usually surrounds these historical projects.
You can safely leave all that behind.
Exactly. We are putting on our lab coats and jumping straight into the biology lab.
And the laboratory we are entering today is a 25-year-long biological experiment. I mean, it is a massive, sprawling, multi-generational study in genetics, inheritance, and behavior.
So we're talking big scale here.
Huge scale. We are looking at a real-world attempt to manipulate the building blocks of life to see what happens when the domestic world literally collides with the wild.
Our mission on this deep dive today is to crack open the DNA of a real-life hybrid. We are going to isolate what are known as the 4 pillars.
The foundational animals of the entire project.
Yeah, these are 4 specific absolute legends of the animal kingdom. 4 Carpathian wolves who literally donated their wild DNA to create an entirely new kind of animal.
It's a fascinating genetic lineage.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we meet the actual wolves, what does a biological experiment of this scale even look like on a day-to-day basis?
That's a good question.
Like, it's not just a couple of scientists in a sterile room with test tubes, right?
Oh, far from it. When we talk about an experiment of this magnitude, we're talking about massive outdoor breeding stations. We're talking meticulous record-keeping over decades and testing a very, very foundational scientific assumption.
Which was what, exactly?
Well, at the core of this whole 25-year project was a single monumental question. Could wild Carpathian wolves and domestic dogs actually produce fertile offspring?
Okay, so just seeing if the hardware matches up.
Right. But getting a single litter of puppies was only a fraction of the challenge. I mean, the true test of biological compatibility was whether they could have fertile offspring in both directions of crossing.
So it wasn't just about throwing a dog and a wolf together in a pen and hoping for the best.
Not at all.
They had to systematically prove the biology worked from every angle, meaning a male wolf with a female dog and a female wolf with a male dog.
Exactly. The scientific community calls that two-way fertility. They needed to prove that regardless of which species provided the maternal DNA and which provided the paternal DNA, the resulting puppies could grow up and have puppies of their own.
Because if they can't have puppies of their own, the experiment is basically over before it starts.
Precisely. In biology, if the offspring are sterile...
Like a mule, right? On a horse and a donkey mate.
Yes, that is the perfect example. When you get a mule, it means the genetic gap between the two parent species is just too wide. The chromosomes literally cannot pair up properly during cell division, and you hit a biological dead end.
The ultimate game over for a genetic line. The code just completely stops running.
To prove that the domestic dog and the wild Carpathian wolf were still genetically close enough to truly merge, They had to bypass that dead end completely. And that is what sets the stage for our four pillars.
Because these weren't just random wolves they found wandering around.
No, these wolves were carefully selected genetic founders. Each one served a very specific, crucial role in this real-world superpower experiment.
Okay, well, every experiment has to have a day one, right? A
Yeah.
starting line. Which takes us to the late 1950s, specifically May 26th, 1958.
A very important date in this timeline.
Yeah, we are at a breeding station in Libiovis, and we meet the Pramatka, the founding mother of the entire genetic tree. And her name was Brita.
Brita was a pure, wild Carpathian wolf. And her introduction to a German shepherd, a dog named Cesar Sovio-Hage, marks the true biological genesis of the project.
So this is where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. This specific pairing resulted in the very first litter of 5 puppies. And in the scientific world, we call this the F1 generation, filial one.
Filial one. Okay, got it.
It is basically the first generation resulting from a cross between 2 distinctly different parental populations.
I am just trying to picture this. You have a wild wolf, entirely driven by, survival instincts, and a domestic German shepherd. Just getting them to share a space, let alone reproduce, seems like a massive behavioral hurdle before you even get to the genetics part.
Oh, the behavioral logistics were incredibly complex. I mean, wolves have highly specific mating rituals, they have strict social hierarchies, and they generally only breed once a year.
Whereas domestic dogs can cycle twice a year. Right.
Right. So the scientists had to carefully manage the environment to ensure the animals even accepted each other. But once they achieved that, the genetic results of that F1 generation were staggering.
What do they find out?
Well, the data from the Lebiovi station showed that these 5 puppies were anatomically 70 to 75% similar to a wild wolf.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you right there. Because this is where my high school biology math starts breaking down.
Okay, let's look at the math.
If Brita is 100% wolf and Cesar is 100% German shepherd, shouldn't the puppy be exactly 50-50? I mean, how do the scientists physically measure a puppy and declare it is 75% wolf when the DNA is supposed to be an even split?
Your math is totally correct regarding the genotype.
The genotype, meaning the actual code.
Yes, the actual genetic material inherited from the parents is a perfect 50-50 split. Half from mom, half from dad. But the researchers were measuring the phenotypes.
Which is the physical outcome, right? What we actually see.
Exactly. The phenotype is the physical, observable expression of those genes. You see, genetics is rarely a perfect, even blend. It's not like mixing blue and yellow paint to get green.
That would be too easy.
Way too easy. We have to look at dominant and recessive traits, specifically polygenic inheritance, where multiple genes influence a single physical trait.
So even though the puppies had a 50-50 blueprint internally, the wild wolf traits just totally dominated the domestic dog traits when it came time to actually build the physical body.
The wild traits were overwhelmingly dominant. I mean, think about the evolutionary history of those genes.
Right, they've been tested in the wild.
Extensively.
Yeah.
A pure wild wolf has been shaped by millions of years of ruthless natural selection in incredibly harsh environments.
Yeah.
So the genes coding for the shape of the skull, the length of the legs, the density of the coat, and the biomechanics of their joints are incredibly robust.
They're survival genes.
Yes. While domestic dog genes, on the other hand, have been softened by thousands of years of human intervention, we've selectively bred them for traits like floppy ears or curled tails, things that don't help you survive a winter in the mountains.
So when those two blueprints crash into each other,
When those sets of instructions clash during embryonic development, the ancient, heavily reinforced wild blueprint largely takes over.
okay, so Brita gave the scientists these F1 puppies, and they physically look almost exactly like wild wolves. They're powerful, they're built for the wild, their joints and skulls are totally optimized for survival. It sounds like a massive success, honestly.
Physically, it was a profound success.
But building our ultimate hybrid character isn't just about the physical engine, it's about how they act. And from what I understand, this first draft had some major bugs.
Yes, the biological reality heavily clashed with the experimental goals. They wanted to create a usable companion. But behaviorally, those wild genetics were just as dominant as the physical genetics.
So they acted like wolves.
Right. Very much so. The F1 puppies exhibited incredibly strong wild traits. Most notably, extreme shyness and a very deep instinctual flight response when they were introduced to humans.
Which, if you think about it, is exactly what a wild wolf needs to survive.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're a wolf in the wild and you just casually walk up to humans to say hi, you do not survive very long. That shyness is a literal survival mechanism.
Well, it is deeply, deeply encoded into their neurology. But for the scientists trying to create a working dog, an animal that retreats to the corner of its enclosure, refuses to make eye contact, and basically cannot be trained is functionally useless.
Right. You can't have a Border Patrol dog hiding in the corner.
Exactly. And Brita even went on to found a second line in 1960 with another German shepherd, a dog named Kurt Zwickowski. They wanted to see if the first litter was just an anomaly.
And was it?
No. The behavioral results were nearly identical. The wild instinct was simply too strong to overcome through standard training methods.
I look at this F1 generation, like the very first prototype of a new invention. Think about the first airplane, or like the first bulky prototype of a smartphone. It proves the concept exists, but it's totally unpolished. It's way too clunky to actually use.
That is a very accurate comparison.
But here's what I don't get. If these puppies were 75% wolf in their behavior and completely terrified of people, why didn't the scientists just shut the whole thing down? I mean, why didn't they look at these shy, untrainable F1 puppies and say, well, we tried, the wild traits are too strong, experiment over?
What's fascinating here is that in scientific methodology, we have to separate behavioral utility from biological viability.
Okay, unpack that for me.
A behavioral test that yields unusable results is not a biological failure. In fact, for these geneticists, this was a massive biological triumph.
Because they proved the hardware actually functioned. The engine turned on.
Precisely. The fact that Brita could conceive, carry, and give birth to 5 healthy, robust puppies with a domestic dog proved that the genetic hardware was fundamentally compatible. The DNA combined without critical errors.
The cells divided properly. The animals grew.
Yes, they thrived physically. That is a colossal win for the baseline hypothesis. The behavioral issues, the extreme shyness and the lack of trainability, those are effectively just software problems.
And software can be patched.
Exactly. Software can be patched, updated, and refined over successive generations through selective breeding. But Brita provided the foundational hardware. She proved the baseline was viable, which is exactly why she is recognized as the founding mother.
Okay, so they have these F1s. Yeah. And they know the female wolf can pass on the hardware safely. But if I'm remembering my biology class correctly, getting half your genes from a mom is one thing. The paternal genes, the ones coming from the dad, can trigger completely different developmental switches, right? They needed to prove this wasn't just a fluke of Brita's specific biology.
Right, and that requirement drives the experiment into its next crucial phase. But it's important to note, it wasn't an immediate transition.
How long did they wait?
There is actually a 10-year gap between Brita's initial F1 generation and the introduction of our second pillar.
10 years. What were they doing all that time?
During that decade, the scientists were meticulously observing the F1 offspring. They were breeding them back to domestic dogs to create F2 and F3 generations and tracking exactly how those wild traits either diluted or persisted.
Ah, so they were studying the ripples before they threw another rock in the pond.
A very apt way to describe population genetics. Once they thoroughly understood the maternal wild line, they needed to test the reverse. And this brings us to 1968, shifting locations to a station in Beechery.
And this is where we meet Argo.
Yes, Argo, the second pillar.
Argo was the first male wild wolf of the entire experiment. And he was paired with a female German shepherd named Asta Z SNB. Now, earlier you mentioned that mating a male wolf with a female dog presents entirely different logistical and biological challenges. What exactly changes when you flip the script like this?
Well, from an ethological perspective...
Meaning the study of animal behavior.
Correct. From that behavioral standpoint, a male wild animal introduces intense logistical hurdles. I mean, a male wolf does not behave like a standard domestic stud dog.
I would imagine not.
His mating instincts, his territoriality, and his courtship behaviors are highly specific and aggressively guarded. So introducing a female domestic dog into his environment carries significant risk if the behavioral cues are misread by either animal.
Because if Asta, the dog, doesn't act exactly how a female wolf is supposed to act during courtship, Argo might not just reject her, he might view her as an intruder.
And the communication barrier becomes a literal matter of life and death in those enclosures. Furthermore, on a cellular level, while both dogs and wolves possess 78 chromosomes. How those chromosomes interact during meiosis and embryonic development can be influenced by what we call parent of origin effects.
Parent of origin effects. Okay,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean for the cells?
It refers to epigenetics.
Epigenetics, right.
Yes, these are chemical modifications to DNA that alter gene expression without actually changing the underlying sequence. Certain genes are basically imprinted to be expressed only if they are inherited from the father, and others only if they are inherited from the mother.
Oh, wow.
So the scientists needed to know if introducing wild paternal imprinting would cause unforeseen developmental issues that simply didn't appear when the wild genes came from the mother.
That is fascinating. So the biological instructions literally behave differently depending on who hands them to you. But, spoiler alert, Argo and Asta pulled it off.
They did. By successfully mating Argo with Asta, the scientists confirmed the holy grail of their initial hypothesis. They achieved universal two-way fertility.
Both directions worked.
Both directions worked perfectly. The offspring were physically robust and completely viable, and Argo's legacy was cemented through his specific descendants, most notably his daughter Ura and his grandson Ink.
They basically proved that this male wolf lineage was fertile enough to be seamlessly integrated into the broader program.
Exactly.
I like to think of Argo as the proof that the system is totally compatible. It's like making sure a USB cable can plug in both ways. Argo proved the biological hardware was fully compatible no matter which way you plugged it in.
That's a great analogy for students to grasp the concept.
But, once you have the hardware working, you've got Brita's kids running around and Argo's kids running around, you run into a mathematical problem pretty quickly. You've proven the science, sure, but you only have 2 wild ancestors in your entire project.
Which is a massive issue in population genetics.
Right, because if you just keep breeding their kids and grandkids together, you're staring down the barrel of a major genetic bottleneck.
Population genetics dictates that closed breeding programs with very limited founders inevitably face genetic collapse. If you only use 2 wolves, the family tree becomes a very narrow straight line.
And it doesn't branch out at all.
Right. And this leads to inbreeding depression.
Which means the code starts breaking down
Yeah.
because there's not enough variety, right? You get weaker immune systems, physical mutations, and basically a general loss of that raw vitality they were trying to capture in the first place.
Precisely. When related animals breed, the chance of recessive deleterious mutations matching up and expressing themselves increases exponentially. So to keep this biological experiment healthy and to maintain the physical robustness they had worked so hard to achieve, they desperately needed an injection of new genetic material.
They needed more wild code,
They needed a third pillar.
which introduces the third pillar. And this is the one that really caught my attention in the notes because he is the absolute wild card of the group. We're jumping ahead to 1974, moving over to a facility in Bratislava, and we meet Šarik.
Šarik, a very important addition.
And what makes Šarik so wild is, well, he literally wasn't from the wild. They bought him from a zoo.
Yes, a zoological garden.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic here. You are running a highly controlled, incredibly serious, multi-decade biological experiment to harness the raw, untamed power of the Carpathian Mountains. Why on earth do you go to a zoo for your next wolf instead of just trapping a completely wild one? Isn't a zoo wolf somehow, I don't know, less authentic?
It's a common assumption. The instinct to view a zoo animal as less wild makes intuitive sense, but it actually misunderstands how genetics operate. Sourcing a wolf from a zoo actually demonstrates rigorous scientific control.
Wait, really? How so?
Think about the alternative. If a researcher captures a wild wolf straight from the mountains, they are introducing an animal with an entirely unknown background into a highly sensitive genetic pool.
Oh, because they have no idea how old it is, what latent diseases it might be carrying, or if it has some pre-existing genetic condition.
Exactly. But beyond the health concerns, there is a massive geographical variable. If they capture a new wolf from the same general region of the Carpathian Mountains where Brita or Argo originated, there is a very high statistical probability that the new wolf shares recent common ancestors with them.
Oh, they might accidentally bring in Brita's cousin, which totally defeats the entire purpose of trying to add genetic diversity in the first place.
Exactly. A zoo, however, maintains meticulous pedigree records. By sourcing Eric from a zoo, the scientists could verify through hard documentation that his bloodline was entirely distinct from the wolves they already had in the program.
That makes total sense.
He represented a completely separate, mathematically measurable injection of what they called the Slovak branch of the genetic pool. And biologically speaking, a wolf born in a zoo possesses the exact same DNA as a wolf born in a den.
The code is the code.
The genetic wildness, the sequence of the nucleotides, does not change simply because the animal lives behind a fence instead of in a forest.
Okay, I see. The hardware is identical, even if the environment is different. And from what the records show, what Eric brought to the project was legendary. His bloodline didn't just add diversity, it created absolute royalty within the breeding program.
Carrick's genetic contribution fundamentally altered the trajectory of the experiment. His genes were passed down and really amplified, particularly through a highly influential descendant named Zavan.
Zazan.
Yes. And it was through Zavan that Carrick's fresh Slovak bloodline eventually merged with the original bloodline of our first pillar, Brita.
Okay, it is the ultimate crossover event. You have the primal, original magic of the founding mother crossing over with the fresh, vital Slovak branch of the wild card. And the result of this massive genetic team-up was a dog named Rep.
Rep from the Border Guard. In the annals of this program, Rep is widely considered one of the most significant animals ever produced.
Really? Why him specifically?
Because he was the living biological proof that combining these distinct wild pillars produced an animal truly greater than the sum of its parts. Rep possessed the physical robustness of the wild, but because he was several generations removed from the original crosses, the behavioral software was finally beginning to stabilize.
Ah, so he was actually workable.
Yes, he exhibited a phenomenon akin to heterosis, or hybrid vigor.
Hybrid vigor, meaning the combination of the diverse genes actually made the offspring stronger and healthier than either of the parent lines on their own. That's incredible. But, even with a legend like Rep proving the concept, the scientists knew they couldn't just keep the experiment open-ended forever.
No, eventually an experiment has to conclude.
They had to lock it down. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the fourth pillar. We are now in 1983. We are back where it all started in Libiovis, and we meet Lejda.
Lejda was the final wild wolf introduced into the program, and similar to Uruk, she was sourced from a zoo, this one located in Lubelka.
And she was paired with a dog, right?
Yes, she was paired with a German shepherd named Bojar von Schuderhof.
Bojar von Schuderhof. Now that sounds like an extremely structured, aristocratic dog.
He really was. He represented the absolute peak of domestic canine genetics at the time, highly structured, incredibly obedient, with a deeply ingrained work ethic.
The ultimate good boy.
Exactly. And their pairing resulted in a dog named Kazan, who became a crucial stud in the final phases of the breeding program. However, Lejda's most significant historical contribution isn't just Kazan, it's what her inclusion represented for the timeline itself.
What do you mean?
She marked the termination of the experimental phase. After Lejda's lineage was successfully established, the documentation notes a specific, massive procedural shift. They began what they called closing the lines.
Here's where it gets really interesting, closing the lines. Because when I read that in the sources, my first thought was a video game developer releasing the final update patch for a game.
That's a good way to look at it.
They've added all the new characters, they've balanced the stats, they've fixed the bugs, and finally they step back and say, that's it, the code is locked. No more wild wolf blood was ever added to this genetic pool after Lejda. But I have to ask, why stop at 4?
Why not 5 or 6?
Yeah. If adding new wolves makes the gene pool healthier and stronger, why not add a 5th or a 10th?
Because that is the precise biological threshold where a scientific experiment must transition into a breed. The goal was never to endlessly mix wolves and dogs just to see what happens. The end goal was always to create a stable, reproducible population. If you continually introduce fresh F1 wild wolf DNA into the pool, you are constantly throwing the genetic balance right back into chaos.
You keep resetting the behavioral software back to that extreme shyness and terror of humans that Brita's puppies had.
Exactly. The introgression of wild genes is highly disruptive. Closing the lines indicates that the population geneticists analyzed the genetic diversity provided by the 4 pillars, Brita, Arga, Uruk, and Lejda, and determined it was mathematically sufficient.
Sufficient to keep them healthy forever.
Yes, sufficient to sustain a healthy, closed population without further outside introgression. So from that moment in 1983 onward, they stopped introducing wild variables entirely. They shifted completely to selective breeding among the descendants of those 4 wolves.
They were no longer creating hybrids. They were stabilizing a totally new biological entity. Okay, so we have isolated our 4 pillars. The foundational hardware from Brita, the two-way universal compatibility from Argo, the strategic genetic diversity of Eric, and the final stabilization by Lejda. We've spent a lot of time looking at the mechanics of how they built this genetic engine.
It's important to understand the foundation.
For sure. But now I want to talk about what they actually built. Because the physical traits these animals inherited are where this goes from a cool biology lesson to straight-up science fiction.
The physical and sensory traits passed down from those 4 wild Carpathian wolves really do provide a fascinating masterclass in evolutionary biology.
I mean, when you analyze the modern descendants of this experiment, you are observing an animal whose physiological baseline operates on a completely different paradigm than a standard domestic dog. Let's break down these physiological stats because I want you, the listener, to really grasp how different these animals are.
Where should we start?
Let's start with their health regeneration because we are talking about Wolverine-level recovery times here.
The metabolic regeneration is perhaps the most quantifiable biological difference. Let us establish the baseline for a domestic animal first. If you take a highly trained, peak-conditioned German Shepherd and subject it to intense, exhausting physical exertion, say, continuous tracking over rough terrain, obstacle navigation, prolonged running, that animal's cellular engine requires significant downtime.
Their battery completely drains. Lactic acid builds up, their muscles get sore, and their nervous system is just fried.
The physiological toll is substantial. Glycogen stores in the muscles are depleted, and the central nervous system requires deep, prolonged rest to reset. For a standard domestic working dog, achieving full physiological recovery from that level of exhaustion requires 10 to 12 hours of continuous rest.
Basically, they work a hard shift, and they need a full night's sleep before they can even think about doing it again.
Now, analyze the data from the hybrids carrying the genetics of the 4 pillars. Under the exact same parameters of intense physical workload, the recovery window absolutely plummets.
What are we talking?
They require only 3 to 4 hours of rest before their physiological markers indicate they are capable of returning to peak physical performance.
3 to 4 hours. That is literally a third of the time. How is that even biologically possible without their hearts exploding? Do they have completely different muscle structures?
It is a complex combination of evolutionary adaptations inherited directly from the wolf's necessity to constantly travel and hunt across vast territories. It involves highly efficient cellular respiration.
Meaning they use oxygen better.
Yes, they possess a higher density of mitochondria in their muscle tissue, which allows for vastly accelerated energy conversion. Furthermore, their cardiovascular system is optimized to clear metabolic waste, specifically lactic acid, from the bloodstream at a significantly faster rate than domestic dogs.
Their bodies are quite literally engineered for endless endurance.
Engineered by nature, yes.
That is unbelievable. Okay, so their physical engine is a marathon machine. What about the onboard computer? The biometrics?
Yeah.
Because I read in the sources they inherited structural differences in their skulls, too.
Yes, the anatomical inheritance extended directly to the cranial vault. The descendants retained the larger brain volume that is characteristic of the wild wolf.
So a bigger brain automatically makes them a smarter dog.
Well, smarter is a conceptually vague term in behavioral biology. A larger brain volume correlates with a greater capacity for complex, independent problem-solving and acute environmental awareness.
Give me an example.
Consider the evolutionary context. A wild wolf survives by constantly analyzing its surroundings, calculating risk factors, anticipating prey movements, and hunting cooperatively in a highly structured pack. That requires massive neurological hardware.
Whereas a domestic dog just has to figure out how to look cute so a human will hand it a piece of cheese.
Exactly. You are actually describing domestication syndrome. Over thousands of years, domestic dogs have lost significant brain volume compared to their wild ancestors.
Totally. They actually shrank.
Yes, because they have evolved to rely on humans to solve complex problems for them. If a domestic dog cannot reach a toy under a couch, it will typically look to its owner for help. A wild animal must figure it out, or it fails. The hybrids retained that raw, independent processing power.
So they have endless stamina, upgraded neurological processors. What about their sensors?
The sensory upgrades are equally remarkable, particularly their olfactory and navigational systems.
Their sense of smell and direction.
Yes, they inherited an exceptional sense of direction. And this is not simply a matter of remembering visual landmarks like a tree or a rock. Wild wolves possess an incredibly sophisticated internal navigation system.
How does it work?
They utilize olfactory cues, an intensely magnified sense of smell facilitated by a larger olfactory bulb in the brain, to map vast distances. There's also ongoing research suggesting potential sensitivity to the Earth's magnetic fields to aid in orientation.
So they basically have built-in GPS that doesn't need a satellite to connect. And what about their vision? I know wolves hunt at night.
Their visual acuity, particularly in low-light environments, is drastically superior to domestic breeds. They retained the wild wolf's enhanced evolutionary adaptation for nocturnal and crepuscular activity.
Crepuscular meaning dawn and dusk, right?
Correct. Hunting at dawn and dusk. This involves a highly developed tapetum lucidum.
Okay, I know this one. That's the part of the eye that makes an animal's eyes glow in the headlights of a car, right?
Exactly. It is a reflective layer situated directly behind the retina. It essentially acts like a biological mirror, reflecting visible light back through the retina a second time. This maximizes whatever ambient light is available from the moon or the stars. It vastly improves night vision capabilities.
Night vision, endless endurance, a biological GPS,
Uh-huh.
upgraded, independent brains. I mean, this sounds like the absolute apex animal.
It is a formidable combination of traits.
But there's one more superpower we need to cover. And honestly, it's the one that immediately reminds you exactly where these animals came from, no matter how much they look like a dog. Let's talk about the communication system. They don't sound like normal dogs.
No, they do not. The auditory communication of these animals is a fascinating behavioral remnant. Over millennia, humans selectively bred domestic dogs to vocalize through barking. Barking is essentially a localized alarm system.
Right, it's a dog saying, hey, someone is at the door.
Yes, it is designed to alert the human pack members to a sudden change in the immediate environment. Adult wild wolves, however, rarely bark.
Which makes sense, because if you're a wolf trying to coordinate a hunting pack across 3 dense mountain ridges, a little repetitive woof isn't going to penetrate the forest.
Barking is acoustically inefficient for long-distance communication in complex terrain. Wolves utilize long, drawn-out howling.
The classic wolf howl.
The acoustic properties of a howl, the frequency and the sustained modulation allow the sound to carry over immense distances, sometimes up to 10 miles depending on the environment.
10 miles, that's insane.
It's highly effective, and it conveys complex information, the emotional state of the animal, the specific location of the pack, and it coordinates group movement before a hunt.
And the hybrids kept that.
They retained this wild method of communication almost entirely. The descendants are far more prone to complex vocalizations, whining, grunting, and particularly sustained howling, rather than the repetitive, rapid-fire barking we associate with standard domestic dogs.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here, because I am looking at this list of biological superpowers. Endless cellular regeneration, night vision, wild howling, massive brains capable of independent problem solving.
It's an imposing list.
Right. If I have a dog that can run all day, see in the dark, howl like a wild animal, and has the neurological hardware to figure out how to unlock gates and escape enclosures, wouldn't that animal just be an absolute nightmare to try and train? I mean, if they have all these independent wild traits, wouldn't they just constantly outsmart the humans trying to manage them?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have just articulated the central crisis of the entire 25-year experiment. Yes, your logic is biologically flawless. And that is exactly why the initial generations, those F1s from Brita and their immediate offspring, were entirely unusable for the military and border patrol service the scientists initially envisioned.
Too much wild superpower, zero domestic control.
The traits were fundamentally at odds with the goal. Having a biological engine that can run for 100 miles without resting is completely useless if the animal refuses to follow the commands of the person holding the leash.
Right. They just run 100 miles in the wrong direction.
Exactly. Having enhanced independent problem-solving skills is actually detrimental to a working dog if the animal uses that brain power to escape enclosures or subvert commands rather than execute them. The pure wild behavioral traits were completely overwhelming the domestic behavioral software.
So how do you fix it? Because you can't just unmix the DNA. Once you've combined the wolf and the dog, the genes are in the pool.
You cannot unmix the DNA, true, but you can manipulate the frequency of the alleles through targeted genetic dilution and intense selective pressure.
Which leads us to the final masterful phase of this biological experiment.
It does. The scientists had to find the exact perfect balance. They needed to retain the physical hardware of the 4 pillars, the stamina, the senses, the health, but they desperately needed the obedient, cooperative software of the German Shepherd.
Which brings us to the magic formula, the golden ratio. Let's talk about the 6.25% solution.
To achieve this balance, the scientists engaged in a rigorous process of backcrossing, Over successive generations, they selectively bred the Wolfdog hybrids back to pure German Shepherds.
Okay, I know earlier I used a really bad analogy about diluting jalapenos in a recipe, like making soup less spicy.
Hmm.
But as we discussed, genetics isn't soup. It's not perfectly even. So how exactly did they get to 6.25%? Let's walk through the math and the biology of how they actually did this.
The math provides the framework, but the biology requires selective pressure. So let's start with the math. If an F1 generation, like Brita's first puppies, is mathematically 50% wild wolf,
Then you take that F1 puppy and breed it with a pure domestic dog. That creates the F2 generation, which mathematically drops the wild wolf percentage in half to 25%.
correct. And if you take that F2 and back cross it again to another pure domestic dog, you produce the F3 generation, which sits at 12.5% wild wolf DNA.
Okay, I follow the math. But this is where the jalapeno soup analogy completely fails.
Completely.
Yeah.
Because you are not just evenly diluting the traits. Every time these animals reproduce, the genes undergo recombination. It is like shuffling a massive deck of cards and dealing a totally new hand to every single puppy.
Ah, so in a litter of F3 puppies, even though they all technically have 12.5% wolf DNA on paper, they might have drawn completely different genetic cards. One puppy might have drawn the wolf's stamina, while another puppy in the exact same litter drew the wolf's extreme shyness.
Precisely. And this is where the rigorous scientific observation was vital. They were meticulously analyzing every single puppy in these generations. They discarded the animals that retained the behavioral shyness or aggression of the wild wolf.
They just removed them from the breeding pool.
Yes, they only selected the specific animals that randomly inherited the optimal combination, meaning the physical superpowers of the wild alongside the behavioral trainability of the domestic dog.
It was genetic cherry-picking on a massive scale.
It was directed evolution. And according to the historical and biological data, it was in the fourth and fifth generations of this process that they finally struck gold.
The golden ratio.
Yes. By the time they diluted and selected the wild wolf blood down to approximately 6.25%, a biological equilibrium was finally reached.
But what was so special about that exact number? Why didn't 12.5% work?
At 12.5%, the wild behavioral traits still flared up unpredictably. It was too unstable. But at 6.25%, the dominant, overwhelming behavioral traits of the wild wolf, the deeply encoded flight response, the extreme shyness, the independent refusal to cooperate with humans, those traits finally receded into the genetic background.
They got muted.
Yes. And the software of the German Shepherd, the evolutionary desire to please, the high trainability, the willingness to work in close partnership with a human handler, that software finally achieved behavioral dominance.
The domestic mind finally took control of the wild body. But what about the hardware? If you pushed the wild DNA down to just 6%, didn't they lose the 3-hour regeneration times and the night vision?
That is the ultimate triumph of this specific selective breeding process. Through meticulous selection, even at only 6.25% wild wolf DNA, the critical physical superpowers remained intact.
That is wild, no pun intended.
They kept the accelerated cellular regeneration. They kept the cardiovascular endurance. They kept the wolf-like skeletal structure, the robust immune system, and the dense, weather-resistant coat. They successfully threaded the genetic needle.
They found the absolute perfect balance.
Right.
The exact threshold where you get the ultimate physical machine, but it actually wants to play fetch and follow commands.
It was a monumental achievement.
And the proof that this wasn't just some isolated lab anomaly is what happened next, because this project didn't just end up as a dusty file in a biological archive somewhere.
Not at all. The ultimate validation of this 25-year experiment was its transition from a controlled scientific project into a living, globally recognized reality.
People actually own these dogs now.
Yes.
Oh.
Once the geneticists locked in that golden ratio, the resulting population was stable, healthy, and highly reproducible. In 1982, the Czechoslovakian Wolfdog was officially recognized as a national breed.
And it didn't stop there.
It did not. The final stamp of scientific and global validation occurred in 1999 when the FCI, the Fédération Cynologique Internationale, which is the primary global governing body of canine breeds, granted it full international recognition.
So it's officially on the books.
Yes. It was officially acknowledged not as a hybrid experiment, but as a distinct, standardized breed.
From a wild wolf captured in the Carpathian Mountains, to a terrified F1 prototype, to a globally recognized breed with a locked genetic code, That is just unbelievable biological journey. So what does this all mean?
It's a lot to take in.
It is. As we wrap up this deep dive, let's take a step back and look at the whole board. We started with this sci-fi idea of designing the ultimate hybrid character, and we walked through exactly how these scientists systematically achieved it.
By utilizing the 4 foundational pillars.
Right. Brita, the mother who proved the baseline biological hardware actually functioned. Argo, who overcame the massive behavioral and epigenetic hurdles to prove two-way universal compatibility. Arik, the zoo wildcard who injected the critical genetic diversity to save the project from an inbreeding bottleneck.
Yeah.
And finally, Lejda, the 4th pillar, who stabilized the pool and allowed the scientists to close the lines forever.
And by taking those 4 distinct wild sources and subjecting their descendants to decades of mathematical dilution and intense selective pressure.
Cherry-picking the genes down to that perfect 6.25%.
Yes. They created an animal that successfully walks the absolute razor's edge between the apex survivalism of the wild and the cooperative domesticity of the living room.
It is honestly mind-blowing for me to think that all of that physical power, the cellular regeneration, the massive brains, the night vision, the howling that echoes for 10 miles, all of it traces back to the specific DNA of just those 4 individual wolves.
It is a profound testament to the enduring, echoing power of genetics. And, it raises an incredible lingering thought for you, the listener, as you head to your next class or just go about your day.
Oh, what's that?
Think about the domestic animals you interact with. The dog catching a tennis ball in the park, the dog walking on a leash down your street, or even the pet sleeping quietly at the end of your bed right now. Every single domestic dog on Earth shares a massive, fundamental portion of their DNA with the ancient wild wolf.
Because they all came from the wolf originally.
Exactly. They are all descendants of the wild, separated only by time and human selection.
They all have that ancient code buried somewhere in their cells.
Hidden deep inside their genetic blueprint is an ancient wild predator just waiting to be understood. In the specific 25-year experiment, scientists were able to deliberately map, measure, and isolate the wild traits passed down from just 4 specific wolves to create a modern physiological marvel. It makes you wonder, if they could meticulously harness that kind of raw power from the 4 pillars, what hidden, sleeping genetic superpowers might be locked away in the DNA of the everyday pets we take for granted.
Wow. I am definitely never going to look at a neighborhood golden retriever the same way again. Just imagining what kind of ancient wild code might still be running quietly in the background. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the blueprint of nature. Keep questioning the science around you, keep exploring the natural world, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.